They don't train us.
Yeah.
Good.
They should be.
Please, that'd be great.
Welcome, everyone.
It's like
Hi there. My name is Amber. I'm assistant manager here at Left Bank Books. I'm also the coordinator for the Left Bank Books Foundation. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. This is Left Bank Books presents Director of the Masters of Bioethics Program at Columbia University, Dr. Robert Klitzman, discussing his new book, Doctor, Will You Pray for Me? Medicine, Chaplains, and Healing the Whole Person. Some notes before we begin. Today's event is possible because of your support. When you support Left Bank Books and the Left Bank Books Foundation, your money goes directly into the local economy, funding your streets, parks, city public libraries, and more. It also helps writers get the support they deserve and allows us to produce events such as this. So thank you all for shopping local, supporting this event, and supporting Left Bank Books. We also want to extend a welcome to our virtual audience this afternoon. Thank you for joining us from afar. We at Left Bank Books have a fantastic calendar of events coming your way. If you stick around tonight until 7 p.m., we have a double feature today. You can catch author Chantel Madison with her novel, The Fallen Fruit. If you want to check it out, we have copies at the front desk. Tomorrow evening, we have another double feature in the store with Sarah Fitzgerald for her biography, The Silenced Muse, Emily Hale, T.S. Eliot, and the Role of a Lifetime at 5 p.m. And then at 7 p.m., Jeffrey Zuckerman with his translation of Jellyfish Have No Ears. We still have tickets available for sports author Joe Poznansky on September 23rd. And you are invited to join the Left Bank Books Foundation in protesting book banning in our state with our silent reading read-in at Tower Grove Pride on September 29th. We hope to have 333 readers, one for every book banned in Missouri. So come on out, let's go. A full calendar and all the details for those events can be found on our website. It was sure to be something for everyone. Okay, so about tonight's title, Will You Pray for Me? Medicine, Chaplains, and Healing the Whole Person. The modern world faces religious, spiritual, and existential quandaries as new technologies redefine the beginnings and ends of life. Excruciating choices arise about when to turn off the machines, whether and when we should play God. The COVID-19 pandemic made these dilemmas ever more acute. Interestingly, however, public discourse on religion and spirituality is polarized, with evangelicals on one side and vehement atheists on the other. Psychiatrist and bioethicist Robert Klitzman explores how patients and families struggle to make sense of serious disease and threats of death and other medical crises, seeking hope, purpose, and larger connections beyond themselves. Physicians and other clinical staff are frequently uncomfortable with these issues, and chaplains have been filling the void, developing valuable approaches and insights. Most Americans will die in hospitals or nursing homes and face existential and spiritual quandaries. Many of their prior religious and spiritual beliefs will fall short, and chaplains will often be the ones to assist, partly by reframing narratives and understandings of illness and spirituality. Yet people often know little, if anything, about these professionals. Klitzman presents stories about the spiritual lives of patients and explores the role of chaplains, who they are, what they do, and the challenges they face. Drawing on in-depth interviews and the author's personal experiences, Dr. Will You Pray for Me? Provides vital information that can assist in medical care decisions. Robert Klitzman argues that a better understanding of the relationship between these realms will enable more holistic and humane treatment of patients. And now I'm going to turn the mic over to Dr. Jim Dubois, the director of the Bioethics Research Center at WashU, to introduce tonight's author.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming out this afternoon. I'm curious, how many are of you are chaplains? All right, so we have a few chaplains in the room. How about physicians? Oh, she has to raise her hand too. And a few physicians, great. All right, this is fantastic. Welcome also to our guests from out of town who are attending the ASBH Bioethics meeting, which in many ways provided the occasion for this. Dr. Bob Klitzman reached out and shared the news that his book was coming out this month, and we were so pleased to be able to partner with Left Bank Books to do this event. We at WashU started a program called Healthcare Values in the Spiritual Life, which is really a research program trying to understand this rich intersection, which, as you noted, gets ignored so often. And so it's really a pleasure to start a conversation on this tonight with all of you. And I think you already know his wonderful credentials, so I'm not going to review them again, but Bob, it's wonderful to have you here tonight. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jim and Amber, and it's really an honor to be here. Thank you so much for coming, and I just want to say how much I admire the bookstore here. I mean, I think that independent bookstore is one of the great places in American life, and unfortunately are under threat. And you in St. Louis are very lucky to have a bookstore like this. So, so keep up the good work. Again, I'm so grateful to Jim for having helped facilitate this. And I think Jim's program is really great because, as I'll discuss, so often physicians and hospitals ignore patients' spiritual lives. And that's one of the reasons, as I'll discuss, that led me to write the book. So I came to the book for a few reasons. One is I describe, unfortunately, my sister died on 9/11. She was working at Cantor Fitzgerald at the World Trade Center and emailed her best friend in the morning. And then my mother called me up and said, "Did you hear that a plane hit the World Trade Center? That's where Karen worked." And I thought, oh, I'm sure she's fine, you know, because you hear something happens somewhere and you assume that your loved ones are okay. Unfortunately, she wasn't. So we had to report her to the FBI as a missing person. I had to go down and do that at the FBI. We had to sell everything she owned, get rid of her stuff, get rid of her apartment. We had no body. It was just she would work there and then she was gone. And like so many people, and so people in New York would put up these signs like, "Here's my loved one, have you seen them?" as if they're wandering around. But I think it was just what to do with the enormity of this loss. So for a few weeks I did all these things, and then my body just gave out. And I felt I had the flu. Like I just wanted to lay in bed. I didn't want to read. I didn't want to listen to music or watch TV or films. And I thought I had the flu. And friends said, "No, this is grief." And I said, no, I have the flu. It's like a bodily thing. My body, something wrong with my body. And said, no, this is grief. So, and of course they were right. I was a psychiatrist, and we often look down at patients who somaticize, who can't talk about sort of the mind and what they're feeling, but something they're complaining, something wrong with their body. But I realized how much we missed the boat, how much this really was part of the experience of grief. And I'm sure people who have other mental illness challenges that they face. At the same time, I wanted to know, why me? Why my family? So the World Trade Center had a few thousand people killed, but no one else I knew had this happen. I was, and so why was my family stuck with having to make these decisions? Even, should we have a cemetery plot? Should we have a memorial service? We don't know if she's gone yet. I mean, what point do you say, well, I guess she really is gone? Because it was a lot of confusion. So I went to my synagogue, I went to a Buddhist service, we walked around and rang bells, and none of it really spoke to me as much as I would have hoped. And eventually I came around and, with therapy, et cetera, I was able to sort of return to my life, but it left a hole. And I wondered how other physicians deal with difficult challenges they face in illness. So I got funding from NIH and did a study and wrote a book called When Doctors Become Patients. So I interviewed 75 physicians around the country, and they all said variations of the following. They said to me, I said, well, how is it different treating patients now, having been a patient yourself? And they all basically said, well, patients used to say to me, "Doc, will you pray for me?" And I'd go, yeah, whatever, I poo-poo it. And then I became a patient. and realize how important spiritual, religious, existential issues are, and how we as doctors just ignore it. So I started doing interviews with doctors and patients, and really focusing on chaplains. And what I heard was affirming my own sense, but just showing me the depth of the problem. So doctors would say to patients, gee, how you doing, Mrs. Smith? Well, I just hope God is ready for me. Well, have you taken your medicine this week? Right? Or, well, how you doing, Mrs. Smith? Well, variations, well, I guess heaven's waiting for me. Okay, well, did you go to your, your radiology appointment last week? So radiation therapy. And so we just sort of missed the boat. And I noticed even on rounds during my training, occasionally I'd see a rabbi with a yarmulke or a priest with a collar in the elevator. And, when we'd go into patients' rooms, they'd quickly get out. And when we left, they'd go in. And it was like two parallel worlds that never sort of intersected. And so I was struck by this. And of course, at the same time in our country, we are undergoing a huge transformation religiously. So the number of people, 30 years ago, the overwhelming number of people in this country were Christian, identified as Christian. That's now no longer the case. It's gone down about 40%. The number of people who say I'm nothing in particular has gone way up, particularly among millennials. People are not going to church or temple or synagogue. They believe they're spiritual but not religious. They may be agnostic, they may be atheists. Most believe in nothing in particular. And of course, in response, you have evangelicals also, and the rise of evangelism that sort of, has a large role in politics. So I thought, what is this whole space? And what does this mean? I thought, well, as a physician, my sense is that patients wrestle with this. And so how do patients deal with this? And how do we respond? At the same time, a few other studies I did in the past, again, these issues would come up, and I'd sort of park them in the back of my mind and didn't pay much attention to them. So I did research on people undergoing genetic testing. I wrote a book called Am I My Genes? Confronting Fate and Family Secrets in the Age of Genetic Testing. And I interviewed people who had or at risk of Huntington's disease, which is a mutation. If you have it, you will die of it. If you don't die of something else first. It's very, very, very penetrant, as they say. And people would say to me, well, I know my sister has the gene and I don't, but why did God give the gene to my sister, not to me? Or why did God give me the gene but not my sister? So again, these questions come up again and again. In interviewing physicians, I saw how uncomfortable they were. So one physician I spoke to said, I use a surgeon. He said, I was wheeling a young boy into the operating room and I thought he probably wouldn't survive. And the family said before I went in, well, doctor, excuse me, would you stand here and pray with us? And I said, well, no, I won't. I don't have time for that. And this doctor said afterwards, that's haunted. Like, I'm an atheist and they were Catholic, so what, I felt uncomfortable doing that. So what should I have done? I said, well, you could have said, well, I'm happy to stand here with you, or happy to support you, or if it's important and I'm happy to be here with you, or something like that. Because a lot of religious talk is really about trust, establishing trust. So similarly, another doctor told me that he had a patient who was Muslim, who was a recent immigrant, literally just come a few months ago from the Middle East. And the patient said to the doctor, "Doctor, do you believe in God?" And the doctor was taken aback and said, "Well, yes, I'm Protestant, but I believe in God." And the patient grabbed his hand and said, "Thank God you're a person of the book." And in this patient's mind, this meant here in this strange land, this strange hospital, I can trust you in some way. So again, I think these are issues that are out there among our patients that doctors unfortunately are uncomfortable with and aren't trained to deal with, and so we just ignore them. And another doctor I spoke to said, a patient said to her, "Doctor, do you believe in God?" And she said, "Well, actually, I'm an agnostic. I'm not a complete agnostic because I'm not really an atheist." And what I mean by that is, and she just want to know, basically, patients just want to know, yes, I believe in something, kind of thing. She wasn't asking for a theological discourse, but doctors basically need to have a script. They need to be ready to deal with these issues rather than not dealing with them and just being caught off guard. Similarly, a Muslim doctor I interviewed said, patients say to me, "Doc, how will I do?" And I said, well, it's all up to God. Because I'm Muslim, and we say it's all in the hands of Allah. So I say it's all up to God. And patients look at me and get annoyed and say, well, can't you just tell me how I'm going to do? So but I have to be true to my faith. So I said, well, you can say something like, we're going to do the best we can to help you. In the end, a lot of things are in God's hands, but we will still try to be here for you. So I think there's this crosstalk that often occurs where people speak different languages and aren't hearing each other. And I think we need to sort of expand our willingness to sort of embrace the whole, so to speak, the diversity of people's views. So chaplains, I started to interview them, I thought were fascinating because they describe themselves as having really a post-religious profession in many ways. And I should say chaplains vary. There increasingly are board-certified chaplains, even though chaplains in the room. They come from different faiths. Increasingly, though, they take a sort of non-denominational or multi-faith approach that enables them to help many patients. They are supportive. They have time to listen to patients. And often what I found is they're often the only person in the hospital who has really gotten to know the patient. So, for instance, one chaplain I interviewed said that there was a man who came in and complaining of abdominal pain, and he got the $1 million workup, and they found nothing, and he went home. And 6 months later, he came again to the hospital and complained of abdominal pain, and again got the $1 million workup, and they found nothing. He went home, and again 6 or 9 months later, he again came. And the chaplain finally said, do you mind if I talk to this person? And the chaplain said, well, when did the pain start? He said, oh, January 3rd, 2019. And the chaplain, what happened? Why then? Well, that's the day my wife died. And no one had sort of, gotten that history. No one had had the time. And I think that's one way that chaplains can help. That's often overlooked, particularly as we have fragmented, fractured healthcare systems. Chaplains often have time to actually sit with the patient and get to know the patient, which I think is a wonderful thing. And often chaplains are the only people doing anything resembling psychotherapy. So in hospitals, a psychiatrist usually only gets called if a patient is violent or is clearly psychotic, and usually it's just meds that are prescribed. Social workers, I think, could do a lot, but often are having to do discharge planning and find hospital beds or rehab beds, and so they don't have the time to do it, et cetera. So the chaplains, on the one hand, help with specific types of faith traditions, as it were. A number of chaplains, particularly from the South, I should say, I interviewed chaplains all over the country. But some in the South, one chaplain I interviewed who said she lives in she said, I live in the buckle of the belt of the bottom. She sees a lot of evangelical patients, and she says patients come in and say, why has God done this to me? I prayed every day. God has let me down. Or patients say, my sister tells me that if only I had prayed more, I would have gotten cancer. What do I tell? I don't know what to say to her. Or I wonder if I prayed more. Or one woman said, she had a child who, when she was pregnant, she was told the child would have Down syndrome. And she debated what to do, and she decided to have the child, and then the child developed leukemia. And she said to the chaplain when her daughter was in the hospital with leukemia, do you think God made this happen because I prayed for my daughter to die after she was born? So we have these views of punishment, people wondering why me. As I said, even with my family with 9/11, I found myself thinking, why me, why us? I think these are common issues that we all face. And I think being able to help patients reframe this and look at what they're saying and think about the larger picture, I think is often having someone to talk to about it is helpful. I was also struck by the ranges of what we mean by things like agnosticism or atheism. So one chaplain said to me that there were 1,000 types of atheism and agnosticism. So one patient, the chaplain told me a story. The chaplain went to see the patient, said, I'm from the chaplaincy service, and the patient went, oh, my God is CNN. I believe in facts, I believe in truth. And so the chaplain said, oh, okay, thanks very much. And the chaplain said, well, let me try again another day. So I went another day, and she said, remember me? And the patient went, yeah. Well, let's talk about the news. Talked about the news and, the president and whatever the issues were. And this was a woman who was basically she was atheist, but she was very lonely. Didn't really know one to talk to. And a part of her shtick was sort of putting people off a little bit, but they ended up having a real relationship. And the patient found it very helpful, even though her religion was CNN. Another patient I interviewed said, I'm an atheist, but sometimes I get on my knees and pray to the God I don't believe in. So I think we have these free-floating ideas. I think that we humans evolved with the need to believe in something larger than themselves. There's a lot of work. When I was in medical school, I worked with a psychiatrist named Robert J. Lifton, who had studied Nazi doctors and how doctors managed to do horrific things, even though they were trained under the Hippocratic Oath. But before that, he studied survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He was the first social scientist to do it in the early 1950s. And he found that people all had a need for some sense of symbolic immortality, he called it, for some sense of living beyond yourselves. That death is a horrible thing we all face. And so people need to have a sense that somehow they'll live on either through their children or through religion or through creative work they do, or sometimes through, drugs and sex and rock and roll, just momentarily getting away from sort of the mundane aspects of our lives. But patients, we all feel this, patients feel this, but it gets challenged when people are in the hospital. And chaplains describe how a lot of people come in with one set of beliefs that then fall apart once they're facing severe illness and death and dying often. And I found this story is very, very powerful. Chaplains also, I think, because they have time, often play important roles mediating conflicts in hospitals. So one chaplain told a story, it's described in the book, that there was a family and the son was brain dead. The machines were keeping him alive, and they decided they would unplug the machines and he would be an organ donor. And the family said, we'd like to be there when you unplug the machines and our son dies. And the surgeon said, no, you can't be there because it's going to be in the OR because we're going to have to, quote, harvest the organs, one of my least favorite words, right there in the OR, so you can't be there. And the family was very upset, like, well, then I don't know if we want to do this. They didn't know what to do. And so the chaplain said, wait, let me try to negotiate this. So the chaplain arranged the family would come in for just 1 minute. When they unplugged, they would gown up. And so the family came in, and the family said, that's what happened. They said, wait a second, could we sing a song? My son had his favorite song, and it was Amazing Grace. And so they started singing Amazing Grace. The whole operating team joined in the song and singing this. People were crying. The doctors were crying, the surgeons, the nurses. Afterwards, so they left after a minute. And the mother then went up to the chaplain and said, I'm so grateful to you. You let me pray my son and sing my son into heaven. So I think things like that are very meaningful in ways that, unfortunately, a lot of medicine, biological medicine, may miss. At the same time, there's also, I should say, a lot of work that shows that religiosity actually is associated with increased cortical thickening in the brain, in the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. That is, that it's thought that religiosity, however we define that, it doesn't have to be a religion in a traditional sense. It could just be a belief in something greater than oneself or a spiritual sense, etc., that it gives you extra neural reserves, as it were, to draw on. And part of this is, I think, the social element of a lot of spiritual religious activities. And again, it doesn't have to be traditional religion. It could be going to a book discussion group or an art class or a yoga class. There are various ways that people, I think, find meaning and connection. But that actually does help with resilience. And also I found that chaplains play important roles with staff. So one thing I found is that chaplains on their own develop various kinds of rituals. So one chaplain said, I developed a ritual where during COVID, when there were a lot of deaths and people have, the staff had deaths in their own families and friends as well as patients, we put a wreath up and every staff member would write on a piece of paper someone's name and put it on the wreath and say something about the person. And then at the end, I thought we'd throw the wreaths out. They said, no, we want to keep the wreaths here in the nurse's room, etc. Another chaplain said, I do chocolate rounds. I go into a box of chocolate to the staff during COVID and said, excuse me, would you like a piece? I'm doing chocolate round. Would you like a piece of chocolate? They said, I love a piece of chocolate. How are things going this week? I've just been so stressful. And, these were helpful ways, again, that chaplains on their own were developing certain kinds of rituals that I think was quite impressive. But often they were unappreciated. Chaplains had told me, I have to decide, which ditch do I want to die in? How much do I want to say to physicians, look, I think we're doing the wrong thing. Chaplains are sort of the low end of the totem pole often in a lot of hospitals. Part of that is because what they do, it's been difficult to quantify. So there have been a few efforts to quantify that, seeing a chaplain has a positive effect. So one, when you leave the hospital, you get a satisfaction scale. How did we do during your loved one's hospitalization? So they were able to look at which patients saw a chaplain and what the satisfaction scores were. And initially it was thought that there was a correlation, then other research showed there wasn't. And part of the reason it wasn't is because chaplains are more likely to see patients who are dying. And so if you then ask the family, how satisfied are you with the hospital where my loved one died, you're not going to get, gee, 5 stars. Recommend the experience for everyone. And I think that's barking up the wrong tree. What I found is that the stories I heard were, to me, extremely compelling. And I think that it's through narratives, through qualitative research, that chaplains can, I think, and we all can help convey the value that chaplains bring in our fractured, fragmented healthcare systems. And I think that that's an approach that's not fully used. I know actually since the book actually came out last week, so this is my first public talk about it. So thank you all for coming and being online. But a few people, chaplains, have contacted me saying they're showing the book to their administrators in their hospital to sort of get more support, to explain. They feel it explains better than they've been able to do in some cases, with more a fuller picture, what chaplains contribute in ways that I think often get missed. I think, though, there are rooms for improvement. I think doctors need to be more aware of these issues. I think chaplains can be more diverse. I think particular issues, chaplains tend to be white. They tend overall to be Christian, though increasingly there are other, small percent are Jewish, but increasingly there are humanist chaplains, for instance. There are Buddhist chaplains. One hospital, one of the doctors told me that every oncologist loves the Buddhist chaplain because he comes and plays a harp with dying patients. And just that alone is sort of this meaningful thing that brings sort of life to the situation, so to speak. Muslim patients face a great deal of difficulty. There's still a lot of Islamophobia. A lot of Muslim patients don't want to say that they are Muslim when they come to the hospital. So I interviewed several Muslim chaplains. One said that he goes through the list. He doesn't look who says they're Muslim because they won't say, but he looks at the names and he sees Muslim names and he knows that's a person to go see. And they're afraid that if they put down that they're Muslim, they'll get worse care in some hospitals. So I think that's something we all need to be aware of. I think also for doctors, I think chaplains model behavior and sensitivity to these issues and to language more generally. So, and there's a question of what is spiritual, what are the bounds of spiritual versus humanistic, for instance. I think there's a blurring there, which I think is okay. But I've been impressed how chaplains often point out how they'll hear doctors say things that aren't said as well as they can and that patients and families hear and suffer by. So one chaplain said she was there at a meeting and the family said the patient had died. The family said, well, is my mother in a box? And the doctor said, no, she's in a bag. And you get the idea. Again, just being aware and sensitive to the language and how other people are hearing this stuff. Is something we do not teach in medical school and something that we need to teach our doctors and all of us to do better. Also, institutions, I think, could do better. One of the chaplains I interviewed said during COVID, she set up a support group. She asked to set up a discussion group for the nurses, and the nurse administrator said, no, this is ridiculous, it's a waste of their time, we need them on the front line. And the chaplain said, well, let me just do it once, and why don't you come? Well, she came, and all the nurses burst out crying as they described how difficult it was during COVID, and the nursing supervisor said, please keep doing this. So again, institutions may not realize the importance. So as Jim said, I see this as a conversation, so I'm going to actually stop talking in a moment. I welcome your thoughts. I can go on talking more of the book and things I found. I found it incredibly inspiring. I'll tell one story. The first chaplain I spoke to actually that led me to sort of do this was an elderly chaplain. She was a nun who worked at a major hospital. A little woman this big, she was like 92 with this halo of white hair, and she came up to me and so I talked to her and I said, so tell me what you do as a chaplain. She said, well, should I go to pay? I knock on the curtain and I say, I'm either going to say, I can either say a prayer for you or give you good wishes. And she says, often, the husband lying in bed says, no, we don't need you. And the wife will say, no, come in. And I said, no, come in. So she'll go in and she said, well, do you want to pray or good wishes? No, we don't want to pray, but we'll take good wishes. And she said to me, I basically say the same thing. I said, may the doctor have the strength to help Joe here as well as they can. May, all the universe come together to sort of help Joe as much as, we all can. May Joe's body respond, may Joe heal, may Joe have, fulfilling activities ahead of him in his life, et cetera. And Joe invariably sort of grabs the nun's hand and says, thank you, nun, thank you so much. So I think there are misperceptions. What is a chaplain? What is religion? Oh no, chaplains are something that the woman said, my God, is CNN. Chaplains may be seen by a lot of patients as being sort of Christian. And I think that it speaks potentially for need to change the name. I think chaplains were originally Christian, and as we live in a little more spiritually, religiously diverse country, whether we need to sort of have the name reflect that more, I think is important, whether we call them spiritual counselors or something like that. I think that's a discussion. And also the ways, as I said, that prayers vary, so that the woman who said, well, sometimes I get on my knees and pray to the God I don't believe in. No, I don't do pray. No, I don't pray, but I do speak to the stars sometimes. Another man I interviewed, a patient said, I'm an atheist, but I believe in the third law of thermodynamics, that energy is neither created nor destroyed, it just goes on. Which to me was metaphorically a very spiritual notion, so to speak. A doctor who I interviewed who was quite ill said, I'm an atheist, but I believe that science is this pure enterprise that has the answers, it can change the world and make the world a better place. So he was a strict scientist, but had clearly ideals about sort of helping the rest of the world and tapping into, I think, that science could show us sort of unique aspects of the universe, for instance. And again, a very spiritual notion. So we have these terms, atheist, agnostic, evangelical, religious, but what they mean to people what they mean to people varies widely. And so I think, coming back to where I started, I think that we live in a polarized world, but I think there's a lot of commonalities as people sort of look for meaning in different ways. And I think that getting over some of the language and understanding the underlying feelings and questions and quandaries that we all face together as humans, I think could help bring us together. So I just want to stop if I have enough time for a discussion. And again, thank you so much to Amber and to Jim and to all of you for coming. Thank you.
All right, we are opening up to questions.
Questions, comments, reactions. I can keep talking if not. Renee.
I want to say that was really, really enlightening. And I guess this is my question. You alluded to this with millennials, and you alluded to the name change. What are some of the things that came from your research that you think we could do better in helping pediatric millennials through, since there's this different nature in our society?
That's a great question.
Now, while it's so polarized.
Thank you. I think conversations to have people understand, where do you get, what's meaningful to you? It's hard for people to talk about the fact that we all die. No one likes to talk about that much. I mean, some people do perhaps, but no one likes to talk about it because they accept it more than others. But I think to find out, we live in a troubled world, I think to also encourage people to think of ideals. Well, I teach students, and a lot are very cynical. A lot of people, the world's screwed up. They use the F word. The political system's all, this is before Kamala Harris became the nominee. They felt more so, kind of like, the political system's kind of fixed, it's kind of against us. But I think inspiring idealism to find out that historically there have been people who believed in things that have made changes, what does speak to you. And people, I think, whether it's yoga, whether it's Pilates class, whether it's Harry Potter movies, I think people do have sources in their life of connecting to something larger than themselves. And I think realizing how important that is. We also have, extremely high increasing rates of substance abuse, mental abuse. I think a lot of that, frankly, is from a sense of meaninglessness. We have established religious institutions that have done many things over many years. They've done a lot of good. Some have done things that aren't so good. They've been abusive of people in different ways, not all, but some. And yet we live in a digital world now. And I think a lot of people get sources of meaning from online communities, for instance. So on Facebook, people say, here's pretty flowers I saw today, or my dog died, or my mother died, or it's my birthday, or I just got promoted, or here's a beautiful picture of the sunset. So I think these are sort of within the realm of people finding like-minded people about spiritual things. We don't label it as that. We don't privilege it as that. And I think that can be a source of strength for people rather than either, we also know we have increasing rates of suicidality and depression among young people. And again, I think some of that is a lack of meaning, a lack of purpose that we've not yet built the institutions that can help them. And I think part of the issue is I've had some debates with people who say, these spiritual things, they're not religion. It has to be religion because religion gives you a ritual, a social structure. It gives you a firm set of things to do. And I think in the modern world, that's not always going to happen. People are not going to say, okay, every Sunday morning I'm going to go to this building downtown. People are going to sit in front of their computer, and some people do, telechurch or something. But I think, seeing what are these things that people are actually doing that are helping them, and then spreading the word out about that, or letting them see in a positive way, and perhaps taking it out of, the corporate capitalistic model where it's not just, Facebook and they're sending you ads, but to find other ways of sorting out, what works that's good. And I think that's what challenge all of us face. Other questions, comments? Yes. Yes.
And if you don't mind, so our online audience can hear.
Sure, okay. Wow, wonderful, this is terrific. It really resonated with me, because in my own work in bioethics, I've done some work as a volunteer chaplain long ago. And those stories really do stick with you. You're having stories that sometimes people are telling you things that they will not tell any other member of the team.
Right.
It is really remarkable what you're holding. And my question to you is, did any of the chaplains you interviewed talk about how they deal with the stress, not just the privilege, but they work in a highly stressed environment. We know this from COVID research that the norm in American healthcare is high stress. And while they have time, they do also feel time pressure. And pressure to be productive and do paperwork and justify their existence and so on. How do they recover and remain resilient in the face of these stresses?
Yeah, thank you for that. So a few things. So one is, particularly during COVID, some they felt burned out. They had to take time out, and they said, look, I realized I need to take time out. I had to go back for, instead of every day, go every other day for a while until I sort of recovered. I didn't talk about becoming chaplains, and there's a chapter in the book about who becomes chaplains. And chaplains, a large number had some other profession before. They worked in the music industry. They were a teacher. They were something else, or some were a minister. They worked in a church, and then they kind of got burnt out hearing about people's, Johnny is not doing well in third grade. What can I do? And they decided that this was much more meaningful to them. So I think it's a calling in many ways. I think that helps in many ways to get through some of the hard stuff. They've all gone through their personal journeys to get there. And I think that, not that I'm going to say that hardens them, doesn't harden them, but it gives them certain strengths. On the other hand, of course, that also makes them vulnerable to being, kind of having wounds that are opened up. But I think they were aware of that and tended to be, because they worked with other chaplains, that was a support. So a few of them said that they were the only chaplain in their institution, and that was very hard. That a lot of them found that by sharing an office with their chaplains, they were able to talk about this, other chaplains understood, and I think that was very helpful. One thing I didn't talk about is that about 2/3 of hospitals have chaplains, 1/3 have no chaplains. And those that have chaplains often have volunteer clergy from the community who are not trained to be chaplains per se. They're sometimes a smaller hospital, a rural hospital. And I think that is, increasingly, chaplaincy itself is also changing as a profession, which you're right, you find interesting, et cetera. So it's becoming more professionalized. There's board certification, et cetera, et cetera. There's a few chaplains in the room who know about this well. And I think that's a good thing, because I think it gives them more multi-faith knowledge, and it also gives them a lot of chaplaincy programs encourage counseling skills. It's important. I think still mediation skills is something that they don't have, that they're ending up doing a lot of mediation because they are seen as a person you can trust in this complex institution. And I don't understand what the doctor said to me, or whatever, so I think this is another area they could expand more. So in short, I think they often work with supportive people. They do need to take time off. I think they're very sensitive to these issues, so they try. And I would say probably as a physician, physicians tend not to be supportive of other physicians', I'll say, psychological challenges. Whereas chaplains, I think, because they're paid low, so they're really there out of kindness, goodness, true, sometimes it's saintly sort of, kind of motives. And that helps them a great deal, though there's some underside of that.
We have a question from
Yes.
someone online, and
Thanks.
I'll get another one. So Clip on YouTube says, because so many times there seems to be a disconnect between medical professionals and chaplains that seems to be as much from discomfort with addressing spiritual questions rather than opposition to spirituality, would you recommend we incorporate some training for medical professionals related to handling spiritual questions and issues?
Yes, completely, absolutely. I think that physicians, Jim is aligned with this, Jeff probably in the back there. So yes, I think physicians need to, in the least, they need to be aware of the importance of these issues to many of their patients and how to address that. If nothing else, physicians are uncomfortable with their uncomfort. So there are studies that show when do physicians talk about these issues and why not? The number one reason physicians say is, oh, I don't have the time or this office space. But if you look and then you ask them scales of how comfortable you're talking about this, that ends up being the biggest predictor of whether physicians talk about it or not. And a lot of it, I think, is historically, a few years ago I went to Epidaurus, I was in Greece, and I went to Epidaurus, which is famous as the largest intact theater, Greek theater of the ancient world. You see like 10,000 people, famously you can hear a pin drop. 10,000 people can hear a pin drop from the stage. But what I didn't, and it's famous, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, et cetera. What I didn't realize, it was actually part of a hospital. So it was in a center of Asclepius, it was a Hippocratic center, and there was a theater, and there was a temple, and there was a hospital with a fence, with a kind of a fence around it. And so the notion that a hospital should also have a theater and a temple was something that was in the Hippocratic era. Of course, that's what you needed. And I think that in the 19th century, historically, as medicine after Pasteur and Koch's postulates became more scientific, American medicine and other medicine of the countryside, we're going to be scientific in medicine. And all that other stuff is quackery. And we're just going to ignore it because we're the scientific ones. And I think that is not the experience of patients. I think patients, one thing when I did the book on doctors becoming patients, I asked them how they change. They also said, patients would tell me they're doing all kinds of alternative therapies. And I'd say, well, do whatever you want. It's all kind of garbage, they would think. But then they became a patient and said, now I'm going to Chinatown and buying different herbs and boiling them and doing all this stuff. So I think there's a bias against the non-scientific that doesn't reflect the experience of patients' lives. And the placebo effect is a proven thing for 25, 30% of patients in a variety of areas. So believing in things is important. So I think teaching physicians to be aware of these issues, being able to talk about these issues. This has been mistaken by some. So I actually wrote a piece in the New York Times a few years ago, and I said that physicians need to be more aware of these issues. And people wrote back saying, that's ridiculous for physicians to force their religion down patients' throats. So I never said physicians should force sterility down patients' throats. They should be aware, though, that for some patients, not all, these are important issues, and be able to, address this rather than ignore it, even if it's just to say, look, we have chaplains on the staff, we'd be happy to help you, I'm happy to set up a chaplaincy meeting, et cetera. But I think the fact that some people thought this was, forcing religion down patients' throats shows the part of the polarization, but these are deeply personal things. There's an old adage, don't talk to friends about politics or religion. And I think that may be true to the degree that it leads to problems, but to ignore the fact that politics and religion are important to your friends is also a mistake.
Thank you. Bob, when I think about the title, I think, wow, there are people who have no one to pray for them. You know what I mean? Like, why would you ask your physician to pray for you? And it strikes me that, I'm curious, as you did your research, do you feel that there are different needs that people who are traditionally religious have versus those who are not traditionally religious? And did that come out in your discussions with chaplains?
So great question. So a few questions there. So certainly there were evangelical patients, but not others, who would see disease as punishment, I think. So that's different than others. On the other hand, there were patients who were, I'll call them atheists, for lack of a better term. I remember once treated a sort of grizzly old guy who was dying, and I said, I've been a mean bastard all my life, and now my kids don't talk to me, my wife hasn't talked to me for 20 years, my kids haven't talked to me for 20 years. I said, well, why don't you reach out to them? And he did. So I think that some patients may not believe, and that can become a vicious cycle, so they can't sort of break out of that. It gets mixed up with other issues that they face. So I think that sometimes there are specific kinds of issues that different patients face. There's several parts of your question.
Whether those who are more traditionally religious have different needs from
Yes.
those who are not, and whether the chaplain spoke about that.
Yes, thank you.
How
Yes.
they try to address those.
Yes, thank you, right. So those are sort of the different needs, obviously, an evangelical person from an atheist. And I think that's the advantage of well-trained chaplains. They can sort of be where the patient is, go where the patient is. So there was a VA chaplain, here's a VA chaplain, yes, thank you. So the VA chaplain I interviewed who said, there's a guy who was in the Iraq War and he basically shot down this plane. They didn't know if it was, they thought it was the enemy or trying to be kids going to their Disneyland, he said. And he felt horrible about that. So having to deal with that and figure out, for that person, where does that guilt come from? And how much of that is a religious guilt? And he was raised in a very evangelical tradition and, the whole sort of story behind that. And so I think being able to sort of trace the roots of that are important. So I think being able to, again, be where the patient is, because you don't know. And again, we have these buckets of terms that don't really capture people's experience. So even, the term for what was none of the above, or, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, other, none of the above. Well, and so there's literature of none of the above knowns, as some of you may know. And that's a pretty useless category. I mean, just trying to go by what they're not. Well, what do they believe, right? And so they believe something, a lot of them. I built and AA has sort of said, it's built on people finding their higher power. And, no matter what, you can be an atheist, agnostic, but most people in the end sort of have a higher power of some kind, or, helping them to find their higher power, however they define that. It could be, I believe in Mozart, that could be a function that chaplains do often play, and that could be helpful. Jeff?
Hi, Robert. Sorry I was late. Two questions that are sort of related. So the first is the question from an online person who prompted this thought. A lot of folks who go into medicine go into it because they feel some sort of calling, and that calling often takes on a religious tinge, and in many cases it takes on an overtly religious it's animated by overt religious belief. And so you come to the bedside with these different stories or different ways of configuring meaning and vocation and calling. Okay? And on the other hand, we find patients increasingly, especially as we get younger people who are becoming adults, having less and less religious language. Do you think the clash, there should be a greater clash between the lack of a language that we might see developing in culture proper and yet a still quasi religious language that we use when we talk about people who go into medicine? Even though secular people will often appeal to something quasi-spiritual when they talk about calling. How do you see that playing out at the bedside?
So great question, thanks, Jeff. So a few thoughts. So one is, I'm continually struck by how these terms fail us. So we have these, religious, spiritual, miracle, prayer, God, and the breadth of concepts that people and feelings that people associated with those is to me quite amazing. And similarly, as I did the research, I looked at the transcripts, the number of times people say, well, I kind of believe, I sort of believe. Like, well, I kind of believe in God, or I sort of believe in prayer, or I kind of pray, or I'm kind of religious, or I'm kind of, so the imprecision around that and is amazing. And part of that is because, I lived for a year in a Stone Age tribe in New Guinea, and studying Kuru, that was a prion disease. It's the same as mad cow disease. So it's a long story. There was a valley, and there was a village in my tribe on one side, and you could see the village on the other side of the valley, and they were complete enemies. And they had different belief systems. And you saw how belief plays a certain element in what we call tribalism, so to speak. But that it brought this village together, like they all believe in the whatever. And so I think we evolved with the need to sort of believe in something higher, that brought us together. Well, I don't really want to go fight. Well, look, it's all for whatever the big thing is. But these exist before language. I think these are inchoate feelings that language doesn't quite capture. And we have a somewhat impoverished language for describing them. Hence, there's a lot of metaphoric writing and religious writing. Jesus speaking in parables. Job is sort of a metaphor, or metaphors in Job or Ecclesiastes, etc. So a lot of wisdom literature, or Buddhist sayings or Zen Buddhist sayings here. They come at things sort of in a circular way because they're hard to describe. And I think that people then reify these terms. So God is this. If you don't believe this, you don't believe in you're Antichrist or not, whatever. And I think realizing that we have difficulty describing this. That I think, as you said, language is a problem. That we need to be able to hear other people's language, not assume that what they are saying is what we think they're saying. Just understand what they mean when they're saying, whatever, my God is CNN, like what does that mean? So I think being open to the interpretive aspect of this, I think, is important, and we don't do enough of that. So I think that would help us get there.
We have time for one more question. Okay. Well, thank you for the very good questions that you did have. I want to go ahead and let you know that we have copies of his book at the front desk, and we have booksellers willing and ready to check you out. And I also want to point out the refreshments in the back that were so kindly brought in. Left Bank cannot take credit for that. It was our team back here. Yes. And also, Dr. Klitzman is going to stay after for signing at the table up here. So please feel free to enjoy some refreshments, have some conversation, buy a book, get it signed. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.